Hello and welcome to today's episode of Served by SHFM, your food service hospitality podcast. The Society for Hospitality and Food Service Management is a community of like-minded professionals seeking educational, developmental, and networking opportunities to enrich their personal and professional goals. Hello and welcome back to Served by SHFM, your food service hospitality podcast. I'm your host, Michael Moore, and in today's episode, we're exploring a very special organization called UpRoot, and it's based here in Colorado, and they're focused on increasing the nutrition security of all Coloradans. So today, I'm really excited to introduce special guests that we have, and we're all about trying to understand how this got started and why this organization is so special. And so we're joined by David Laskarzewski and Rita Hennigan. They are co-directors at UpRoot. And we're just really impressed by everything they're doing as SHFM looks towards charitable partners for the Hunger Games this year. We came across them and we're really excited to announce that they are our charitable partners for the Hunger Games at our national conference. So thank you so much for being on with us today. So today we are going to explore really what UpRoot is. And for those that aren't familiar, that weren't in this process of selection, can you two tell me what is UpRoot?
Sure. Yes, I'd be happy to. And just before I jump into kind of a brief overview of what UpRoot is and what we do, I just want to say thank you so much for having us, Michael, here today to speak on your podcast. And also, in general, we're really excited to have been selected as the partner for the national conference and for Hunger Games. So we're really looking forward to that and appreciate your partnership.
I love it. Thank you.
Yeah. So brief overview, UpRoot is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that serves the Colorado food system and a whole bunch of stakeholders therein. And our goal is to increase food equity throughout the state of Colorado. Our mission is to specifically increase the nutrition security of Coloradans by harvesting and redistributing surplus nutrient-dense foods while also supporting the resilience of farmers. And one of the ways that we do this is through our gleaning initiative, where we partner with farms, orchards, and even folks who have fruit trees in their backyards, for example, to harvest surplus food that otherwise wouldn't be harvested, sold, or eaten. And so we organize groups of community volunteers to get out onto farms, harvest that surplus food, and redistribute it to folks experiencing food insecurity through partnerships with hunger relief agencies like food banks or food pantries, and all sorts of organizations that serve individuals who experience food insecurity.
So, we hear that a lot. It's one thing that I think is important, and maybe to clarify, when we hear the words food insecurity, what does that mean?
Sure. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture defines food insecurity as an economic and social condition in which a household or an individual does not have or has limited access or uncertain access to adequate food. And so you're considered to be experiencing food insecurity if you're not sure where your next meal will come from, or if you have to make decisions about when you get to eat, how much you get to eat. You may be put into a situation where you choose to feed your children and you eat a less substantial meal yourself. That would also be considered food insecurity.
That term goes so much deeper than I think, at least for myself, it's given credit on the surface when you think about the terrible decisions people have to make of who gets to eat, if anyone, in a family. And the fact that UpRoot, as I understand it, did I get this right? So UpRoot is working with farmers and farms and calling people to come out and use the word gleaning, right? It's called gleaning. When something's been harvested, a harvest has come through, there's ample amount of produce left that just simply was missed by the machines or was deemed imperfect. And so you and your team of volunteers, you come in and you gather it and you disperse it to food banks, to food pantries, that type?
Yes, exactly. And I'd love to spend just a couple minutes talking about that term gleaning.
Yeah, please do.
Something that, I've found as I've kind of settled into my role with UpRoot over the past year, not all folks are familiar with gleaning in this agricultural context. And so In this context, gleaning refers to the agricultural practice of harvesting surplus fruits and vegetables from a farm field that otherwise might not be harvested, sold, or eaten. And it typically happens after farmers have gone through and conducted their commercial harvest of their fields. Or there are also situations where it may not be economically viable for farmers to harvest all they grow. And so going in and harvesting surplus for that reason would be considered gleaning as well. And it's a practice that has a really long history. It's first mentioned in some biblical texts like the Old Testament or the Tanakh. And in that period, gleaning referred to the act of farmers would leave sort of the periphery of their field unharvested intentionally so that people experiencing poverty could come and harvest that food so that they would have something to eat.
Wow.
And so that has been going on for, Dave, correct me if this is wrong, but thousands of years. And modern day gleaning is similar in that, we're getting folks together to harvest food that otherwise wouldn't be harvested. But the reason that modern day gleaning exists and that modern day surplus exists on farms is usually due to factors that are outside of farmers' control. So some of those you referenced, Michael, it might be a cosmetic imperfection issue where a crop doesn't meet certain cosmetic standards such as size or shape. Mm-hmm. And so they may not have a market for that food. And that's one instance in which farmers would have surplus. Another reason is there's an agricultural labor shortage. So farmers may not have all of the labor help that they need to harvest everything that they grow. And those are a couple of kind of the key reasons why modern day surplus exists on farms.
And how much is, I guess, considered surplus, or how much is able to be gleaned out of like an average harvest?
Do you want to take that one, Dave?
Sure. Thanks, Rita. And also, I want to share gratitude to you, Michael, and to the association for taking us in under your wing and kind of bringing us into your community. Average glean is going to differ because it depends on the size of the farm. So we work with farms that are, a half acre. Tomorrow, I'm heading to a farm that's several hundred. So it really depends on the farm.
Okay.
I can tell you a fact from the organization Refed that they estimate that 34 billion with a B pounds remain on farm surplus every year. And those, again, are by and large, the factors that Rita shared are a part of that equation.
With a B. I'm just going to say it one more time. With a B, that number that's staggering. And are there, this is, and I'm by no means an expert in any of these types of organizations, but are there a lot of other organizations doing something similar to what UpRoot does? This is very unique in what I've seen. They're just a completely different approach to fighting, food insecurities and nutritional insecurities.
So I would say, yes, there are other organizations that glean in the same way that UpRoot mm-hmm. does throughout the United States and in different countries across the world. I would say that organizations that glean are not kind of the biggest players in terms of food equity work towards food and nutrition security, or maybe not the most recognizable names, but there are folks organizing similar efforts throughout the country. We are members of an organization called the Association of Gleaning Organizations that is a network that brings organizations like UpRoot together for sharing resources. And I attended the Association of Gleaning Organizations conference earlier this spring and got to meet some folks doing this in different parts of the country. So there are folks that are doing it. And there's a great website called the National Gleaning Project. Mm-hmm. And they have a map of all the organizations that are working on gleaning and other sorts of food rescue across the United States. That's a good place to learn about others who are doing similar work in other parts of the country.
That's awesome because, as I've explored what you've been doing and the conversations that we've had, I always draw back to the members of SHFM and how national and global they are. And looking at what you're doing, I work a lot with sustainability directors and others in similar roles to look at some things, sometimes it's packaging, sometimes it's, other things, but food is such a huge part of the sustainability cycle. And I think that's information that all of them would love to have, is knowing where organizations like UpRoot are in the country, because these operators, these professionals are looking at things on a national and a global scale, and having those resources made clear and available to them, I think would be a huge hurdle in some of the things that they're looking to overcome, some of the initiatives that they're looking to put in place. And so I want to step back a little bit and look at how this started. So I think I have a better idea of what you're doing now, which is, making sure that these wonderful things, this produce, which is really important, I think, to point out that these are highly nutritional harvests that are happening, tomatoes, fruits, all this kind of other stuff that I think are harder to get in stock at food banks and things like National Rocky Mountain Food Bank, those types of things. I don't think they have as easy access to them. So I think that's really important. But going back to it, how did this start? Where did UpRoot come from? And Dave, maybe that's a question for you, I think.
Sure. I'll give a little bit of a backstory, and just backing up even further. I think that it's important to, from a vernacular standpoint, begin to talk more about nutrition security, even more so than food security, because I could be food secure, but nutritionally insecure. So I think that as we move forward, and there's been articles written about that subject, but thinking about it, how can we support the physiologies of people, not just their bellies, but their entire physiology? So I think heading forward and thinking of it as nutrition security, I think is a good way to go. UpRoot itself its backstory began in 2016, in late 2016, at an event, prior to an event called Feeding the 5,000 Front Range. So Feeding the 5,000 was a construct of an existing nonprofit in London called Feedback. One of its co-founders is Tristram Stewart, who in food waste circles is quite a well-known guy. The idea of Feeding the 5,000 is to call attention to the ubiquity of food waste. We differentiate. We talk about food waste as being household and retail. It happens at that level. We talk about surplus. If there's extra on the farm, it's surplus. It puts less of a burden emotionally or mentally on a producer, on a farmer, if we use that vernacular. And also it's an opportunity. What can you do with that surplus? How can you reprocess it? Can you sell it? Can we donate it? So it's a more positive way to approach it, and puts less burden on a farmer who has surplus in some cases by no fault of his, her, or their own. So the premise of Feeding the 5,000 is to take food that was kind of tabbed for the landfill and partner with chefs in an urban setting, partner with other NGOs in an urban setting where you have a high pedestrian kind of traffic area. And the chefs make food out of the food that would be going to waste, and you're handing it out for free between like an 11 and 4 time frame. So lunch-ish time area. And people are like, wow, this is great. Why are you giving me free food? And you've got volunteers with a pledge card and an information card to say, hey, did you know a third of the world's food is not eaten, is thrown away? Did you know that 25% of freshwater resources in the United States is attributed to food that's never eaten? And it just kind of begins to hopefully educate just passersby, the kind of the citizenry, if you will, to take steps within their own household to find ways to value food more. And so what we did this in Denver, and we partnered with a bunch of nonprofits, with EPA Region 8, with the city of Denver was great. And Jen Jasinski and her team of chefs were the volunteer chefs. And they emailed us and they said, hey, we need some veggies, the palette of food that you got us. We want to make curry. So they gave us a shopping list, and we went to 2 Gleans. We got about 1,500 pounds of food in a couple of hours over 2 days. And we brought the food back to Jen, finished with the event. And there were some folks from Feedback on the ground from London. And we had a debrief a couple of days later. And we kind of asked them, what do we do now? And they said, well, you do nothing now. And there was a pause, and they said, but if you want to do something, think about what that might be in your own backyard. And so a couple of us around the table that were on those gleans for this event, for Jen and her chefs, to get her some vegetables. Notice this was mid-October in Colorado. Notice how much food was still in the fields. And we're like, is anyone going to do anything with that? So we went down the road to explore that, and feedback put us in touch with, as Rita mentioned, there's other organizations around the country and even the world that recover food on farms. Feedback put us in touch with that. We looked at Colorado. Is anyone doing this? And looking at Colorado as its own food system. And that's how it started. We got our fiscal sponsorship in December of 2016. We were fiscally sponsored for 3 years to try to see if what we were proposing made sense. And we received our letter of determination, our nonprofit status, in February of 2020.
Wow. So we covered where you started. We've talked about the important work that you're doing. Let's look forward a little bit. Let's look, say, 2 years, 5 years, whatever that number is. Where do you want to take UpRoot? Where do you see it growing? Or how do you see it growing, and what do you see it becoming?
I think that, any nonprofit's mission is to, Robert Egger, I think, put it, if you're in hunger relief, your goal is to serve fewer and fewer people. Your goal is to, by creating larger impact, your growth actually should somewhat begin to be reduced. So, and the idea there is, if you have efficacy and partnerships and positive impact with your work over time, you should begin to see the results of that. So, 2 to 5 years, I don't know that we're going to see a food system that has an integrity with food equity for everyone, with food sovereignty, with farmers feeling like it's a vocation, that if you're young and you want to go into agriculture, that you can make it. But I think those are the goals we have to work toward. Our mission, as Rita shared, we have to make decisions based upon how do we get a little bit closer to that mission. And so my hope in 2 to 5 years is that, this organization touches more lives, partners with more farmers, works from an advocacy standpoint. Recently we've held a site visit with Congressman Crow's staffers, and just to try to invite legislators even to farms and have them get their hands in the dirt, have them understand more closely and intimately how difficult it is to grow food, how important food is. I know we all viscerally know how food is important, but do we know it in our souls? And so I think making that connection and leveraging the community and leveraging volunteerism, and the more volunteers we can get onto farms to reconnect with their food system, it's all of our food system. Everyone's an active member in this food system simply by eating. Taking more an advocacy role over our food system, to all be mindful of how we can create less waste, how can we create more equity, how can we have more appreciation for our food and increase what we call cultural food wisdom.
So let me know if I'm summarizing this correctly. A few years ago, you were a part of something that was wildly impactful to you. And when the opportunity came and you asked what's next, and there wasn't an answer, you found what was next, and you found that you couldn't just let it go at one positive impact. You had to keep that going. And your sincere hope as an organization is to one day be obsolete because there isn't a need for you, to hang up the boots because you found us, or you've created or helped create or advocated for a system that's now equitable to everyone. Does that sound right?
It sounds right. I think that, I like the ocean too. So if it's time to go save the whales, if we've done a good
the next great adventure,
I'm happy to go on that adventure. I think that, but it really is it's a collaborative effort. It's everyone that can make a difference. And so at that moment when the folks from London said, but it was obvious to us that needed to be explored. And so I think it was Einstein that said something to the effect of those with the privilege to know have the duty to act. And so it felt like we should go check that out. And, if there happened to be an UpRoot at that time, we'd be like, oh, okay, someone's doing that. So maybe we'll volunteer. But there wasn't. So it just one step led to the other. And you just have this kind of, you need to follow that thread. Where is that going to lead? Because that there are inequities, that there's suffering, that there's struggle. And once you see it, like, I feel like you're responsible to address it.
Mm-hmm. And following that idea and that thread into October, will you be, a part of our national conference, and you'll get to see and I hope educate people that are very interested in topics like this and that need people like you to help them understand the resources that are available and the steps that can be taken. If you could have every member of SHFM walk away with something from national conference, walking away from their experience with UpRoot, what do you want them to walk away with? What do you want them to take from that?
I think I've talked a lot. I have an answer. It's a little bit snarky, but I have an answer. I'm gonna let Rita handle this one.
We like snarky.
I can still. Okay. Well, when I was a kid, I was a big fan of Mahatma Gandhi and his story and what he did. And so, I wrote these notes, y'all, whoever's listening to this, I wrote these notes when Michael sent these questions. It was close to midnight. So sometimes around that time I get a little goofy, but I wrote, the famous magnet of Gandhi saying, be the change you wish to see in the world. And I would say, be the change we want to see in the world as us at UpRoot. So help us realize our mission of equity and more support for producers and just a more democratic food system.
What about you, Rita?
I would say that sounds about right, Dave. I definitely agree with what Dave shared. And also, I would encourage folks listening to this and the folks who are going to be at the conference to just begin to, think critically. I know that you all work in food systems every day in a different area than where Dave and I are working, but just our message generally to anyone with whom we can connect is to think critically about how our food is produced, the implications of our food production, both in terms of, on the people involved, on the environment, begin to kind of dig up information on those topics and seek to connect with the producers in your local food system, whether that's by, researching your local cleaning organization and getting involved, getting out on a farm for a couple hours of time and kind of feeling what that's like for a little bit of time, or going to the local farmers market and connecting with a farmer that way. I think any way that you can seek to learn more about what sort of food production is going on in your area and the implications of that, that's a message I'd want everyone to take as well. And on top of learning about your local food system, thinking about kind of your own behaviors around food is something else that I like to encourage folks to do. So, maybe do an audit one week of how much food you're throwing away in your household and consider the implications of that. I've always found it interesting that according to ReFed, which is that national organization Dave mentioned earlier, it's an acronym for Rethinking Food Waste Through Economics and Data. And so they are an organization that we lean on for all sorts of data around this topic. And they've shared on their website and in their materials that along the food supply chain, the most significant source of food that's going unutilized happens in our households. And that's more than on farms. It's about double the amount of food that is surplus on farms is the amount of food that gets wasted by households. It's more than happens at the manufacturing level or in transit. It's more than happens at retail and restaurants. The most significant chunk of surplus food that is food going unutilized happens in our households. And so I think that that's an important message that I'd want to share with folks and just encourage folks to sit with that and kind of do a study of what that looks like in your own household.
That number is both impressive and depressing at the same time. Impressive in its size, and I think also depressing in its size, because you don't think about that. I mean, you think about, you hear stories of going behind XYZ establishment and in the dumpster it's full of whatever that people say could have been used. And not everyone, people are sometimes quick to point fingers at some organization or another, but not many of us are introspective enough to look into our own backyard and say, what am I doing? Am I doing the same thing? And I mean, I know we make a concerted effort at my house, but I know we're just as guilty as probably most out there for doing just what you're talking about. And so how else can we support something like this? You've talked about advocacy. Obviously, funding is always important to growth in something like this. Is there something that you found particularly effective in the growth of UpRoot, in maybe getting traction in one direction or another, some type of support or some type of initiative that's really set you on the right path or gain momentum for you?
Michael, I might just go back for 1 second while I give Dave some time to consider that question, and say that, in one regard, that statistic I shared about the fact that, most food that is going unutilized is happening in households, you mentioned that's a depressing statistic, but I also feel like on the flip side, it's kind of hopeful for me, because that's something that we all can have a tangible impact on in kind of the immediate future. The more that we kind of spend time talking about this and, sharing this information with folks and getting the word out there, that's something we each can do something about every day immediately. As soon as we hop off this podcast, we can do something about that by taking those bananas in our kitchen, and instead of letting them go brown, chop them up and freeze them and have them ready for smoothies for the week. So I think that I like to think of that as, it's a lot of food that goes to waste at kind of the household level, and that's discouraging. But at the same time, we can do something about it. So
that's a good point. It is fixable. It isn't something that people look at and say, I can't do anything about that. It's got, as bad as it is, it does have that going for it. That's true.
I will say that I'm also pretty geeky about this. So for anyone who lives locally in Colorado, I'm happy to come over and help you with that food audit.
I love it.
I will help dig through and
hands-on volunteer.
Yeah, for sure.
So in terms of support for your initiative, for UpRoot, we've talked about how important advocacy is. Obviously, funding for an organization like yours is pivotal to get the word out there. But is there something you can think of that's really helped UpRoot maybe gain traction in a certain direction that we can do that's a repeatable thing that someone from SHFM or anyone listening to this podcast can do to help support, something that we haven't touched on yet?
So you're asking supporting UpRoot directly, or like the idea behind UpRoot's mission?
I guess both, because they're both really important. What UpRoot is doing is, I think, essential to getting the word out there and the education that we need to help fight food insecurity and food or nutrition insecurity. But at the same time, you're not alone in this. So we're looking at kind of on a national and a global level. What can what's one thing that you found has been most supportive in your journey that people have done for you that, we can do to continue to help UpRoot and organizations like UpRoot?
Well, I think the first thing is, from a local standpoint, is I realize this is not going to be applicable to probably most of the listening audience, but is volunteerism. And so one of our premises is the more we can leverage community volunteerism to re-engage with its food system, to see and learn about a food system that has surplus and deficit, to, look at hunger or nutrition or food insecurity in the face, and kind of ground yourself in the fact that there is suffering and farmers suffer. I was at a farm a week ago, and they had just had hail the night before, and there were acres that were damaged. And he was looking at me as like, I could be done with this crop for the season. And so you just have to listen in those cases. So I think it's really slowing down a bit and considering, again, going back to your own backyard, feeding your own chickens, if you will, and thinking about what can you do, as Rita mentioned, within your own day to day and not being judgmental, not saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe, I let these strawberries go bad. It's just, that's not really going to help anyone. But just think about it from a holistic standpoint, that these strawberries took someone a lot of water and a lot of time and a lot of effort to get to you. So let's try to revalue our relationship with food. And because food is a vernacular that is spoken by everyone. It's a way to create more democracy. It's a way to create conversation and relationship, even from people with opposing views. So I think philosophically, which is also tangible in our food system, wherever you are, you can make a great deal of difference just by, as Rita mentioned, kind of looking at how you have your relationship with food. From UpRoot standpoint, we're a young organization. So this is going to be very self-serving, but yeah, this is why I tried to clarify this question. We can use vehicles, we can use help with storage space, we can use help with funding, so we can take our 4 part-time people and try to create full-time roles. We are young, and this is one of the reasons we appreciate you inviting us into your community. It feels very base and very business-like, but the fact of the matter is, we do need support and also ideas. Like, are there ideas that we can take something that's surplus and turn it into a product? I'm going to be talking with someone in the fall out on the West Slope, where they have it's like a peach packing, fruit packing house. They have what they call culls, which is considered number 3s. So they are so bruised. There's kind of, some of them are liquid, and these are fruit. This is fruit. But they sell these organic culls for 25 cents a pound. And so I'm going to contact with these folks, say, what can we do with this? How can we make that is it possible to make that into a product, and then have some of that revenue go to UpRoot, into a nonprofit, into education of the community? So I think we're also looking for ideas, and collaborative ideas and partnerships that way too would be phenomenal, because you're talking about resilient capacity for an organization to pursue its mission and to hopefully achieve its mission.
That's awesome. I love the outside the box thinking. And just in your time at national conference, I'd say take advantage of some of the most creative minds in our industry being there, because a lot of what they do is focused on different issues, but in the similar mindset of how do we take something and create from it and make something that can solve a problem for everybody along the way. So that'll be interesting to hear their feedback, because there's so many great minds that I get a chance to connect with at SHFM that I believe could throw some pretty good ideas your way. So I want to thank you both for jumping on with us today and educating us about the importance of what you're doing, how you're trying to do it, and really what we can do to help support yours and other similar initiatives. And we always end our podcast with one fun question. And so I'd ask you both to, if you had the opportunity to reach back through time and look at the young Dave, the young Rita starting off on their career, and the journey that became UpRoot, what would you tell them? What advice would you give them?
My first job was in advertising, and I always wanted to be a copywriter. So I started as an account executive. The agency I worked for was Foot Cone Building, and they were based in Chicago. And Bruce Mason was the CEO at the time, and he would sign off all of his communications to staff. It was global. Foot Cone Building at the time was global. Remain fearless. And I think that there's a lot of value in trying to muster courage to create change. So, I think, fear is the opposite of love. And so if you can muster courage, that's a very shareable value that others can also buy into and lean into. So I think what I would say to myself is, kind of what Bruce Mason said to us back then, is to remain fearless.
Wow. You I don't know if there's a right answer to that, but I do believe you nailed it. Rita, top it.
I was just going to say, Dave, you should have let me go first. That's a really good note to end on. And I think that, I just joined the UpRoot team myself about a year ago. I wasn't involved in the early days of UpRoot. And so I still feel like I'm learning so much every day, and feels hard to, look back and give myself advice on when I was getting started with UpRoot. So I really don't know that I have something that I can say to top that, just that, be opening to continuously learning. And Dave, I'll take your advice moving forward on this journey with UpRoot. So thank you. I
think, Rita, you're also that question kind of cornered you a bit because A, you're young. B, you're smarter than me.
So she's smarter than both of us. That's fine.
So, it took me a while to learn what I've learned, but I think that you're already pretty far ahead of the game.
Well,
yeah, I was going to say, I think both of you together, just in talking and listening to the passion and the just very well thought out approach to what you're doing, I think you're going to be impactful no matter what. But to help support that along, I want to ask everyone at SHFM, all of our listeners, anyone that's even thinking about going to national conference, please support the Hunger Games. Support SHFM's national conference and make sure that you support UpRoot through the Hunger Games, because on October 18th, we are going to see something I think very impactful, and we're going to see some of the best minds that we've had on this show really tackling a really important problem for us. So please make sure you register for national conference. And if you do nothing else, please support the Hunger Games and make sure that we get UpRoot what they need. All right. Thank you both for being on with us. And that's it for Served by SHFM. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Served by SHFM, your food service hospitality podcast. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed on today's episode are not necessarily those of SHFM or any of its members.